So hi Ivan, how are you feeling today?
I'm good.
Good. So the thing we're getting onto in this episode is the SNP Economic Policy, and you're someone who knows more about that than most people. So could you just give us a broad outline of what it is they're proposing this time round?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's the SNP bringing forward an economic policy for the whole of the UK. So it's not what we're going to do in Scotland for the Scottish Government. It's not what we're going to do in Scotland when we're independent. It's what the SNP thinks the next UK government should adopt as a policy for the whole of the UK. Now, the principle of it is anti-austerity. And it's all about the idea that we're in the mess we're in because the austerity economics, which involves cutting government expenditure, leads to a reduction in government income because government's investing less in the economy. And you get into this downward spiral where the government's spending less, but they're getting less income, and one feeds off the other. So it's to reverse that trend and get the economy moving in the right direction. Now, people say, well, why is the SNP concerned about the UK's economic position? Well, the reality is, of course, that we need to have a strong UK economy, whether we're part of it or whether we're independent and not part of it. Because if we're independent, the rest of the UK obviously is still our biggest trading partner, so it's important that they're doing well as well. So the policy itself, as I say, it's about increasing investment, an increase in government spending of 0.5% for the next Parliament, which doesn't sound a lot.
No.
When you translate it into numbers, cash-wise, it's actually 180 billion, which is a number that gets talked about because that's spread over 5 years, and UK budgets are so big that's what 0.5% is. But all that does is actually take the government spending on investment back to where it was before the crash in 2008-9.
And where would that investment go?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. The best way to do it is to invest it in capital projects where you can, be that building schools, building hospitals, house building. That was something that's come up in the election discussion as a requirement, and investment in that would be significant, create a lot of jobs and do a lot of social good as well. Or roads, railways, bridges, whatever. But again, spread throughout the whole country, not focused as often has been the case in the southeast of England.
And where does it differ significantly from, for example, Labour economic policy?
Well, Labour policy, they've signed up to the Tory austerity agenda, which means another 30 billion of cuts coming down the pipeline. So there's very little difference between Labour and Tory policy in terms of austerity. And the SNP policy is going in the opposite direction. It's increasing spending. Now, people say, oh, you can't afford it, etc. But the reality is that if you look at the way this works, when you invest that money, you create jobs, you get the growth in the economy, and you get government income coming back in to fill up the coffer. So it does move the process forward and does pay for itself over a relatively short period of time.
With the SNP's policy also a full fiscal autonomy, what would happen to the oil revenues in that situation? Do they still continue to go into the shared UK budget, or do they come into the Scottish budget with full fiscal autonomy?
Well, we're talking about a different thing there. I mean, we'll leave aside that's the SNP's policy for the whole of the UK that we just talked about, and you talk about the full fiscal autonomy situation. And under full fiscal autonomy, if it is full, then all of the revenue in Scotland comes to the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government looks after the expenditure. That would therefore mean that oil revenues would be included in that. Yes, I would expect, as we said before, it would take a period of time to move towards that because systems, etc., and processes need to be set up. You want to move towards it as fast as you could. But when you got there, then yeah, oil revenues would flow into the Scottish Government's funds.
So apart from UK nationalist grandstanding, is this one of the reasons why Labour might not be supporting a coalition with the SNP, or at least not openly supporting it at the moment?
Well, I mean, that whole thing is another debate. They use this coalition word, but it's a meaningless word because the SNP pretty much ruled out a coalition with Labour a long time ago. So when Ed Miliband says he rules out a coalition, he's really just saying something that isn't relevant to the debate. What's important is the question that Nicola asked, which was, would you support us in voting down a Tory government? Because that's really all that matters. Once the Tory government is voted down and Ed Miliband's in number 10, then you proceed on a case-by-case, vote-by-vote basis, which is very, very different from the coalition arrangements we've got at the moment.
Do you think SNP economic policy is likely to be adopted to a larger or lesser extent? With these kind of things, there's often a certain element of stealing of policy. They'll repackage it and take it and pretend it was theirs. But I mean, do you think some of these things could actually get onto the statute book?
Well, I think economic policy is very much a direction, so it can move by degrees. Every time you have a budget or a spending review, you're moving in one direction or the other. So it really comes down to an influence. And it's SNP putting this policy out there, making people aware of it, people looking at it and understanding austerity isn't the only direction, and they're influencing as much as they can to move a Labour government in that direction. And I think they will have significant influence if the parliamentary numbers are right, because I've got to believe that a lot of people in the Labour Party recognise that that is the way to go. And once they're free of having to track the Tories ever more to the right, then they'd be quite happy, I think, to move in an anti-austerity direction.
Thanks, Ivan.
Thanks, Michael. Talk to you again soon.
And so to the terminological inexactitude of the day. But first, boggle-eyed hysteria of the day, as snivelling wretch Piers Morgan oozed himself onto the pages of the Daily Mail to describe Nicola Sturgeon as the most dangerous woman in the world. Yikes! Previously she'd been the most dangerous woman in politics. Then in Britain, where would her ambitions end? Was an army of cybernats under the influence of a control device masquerading as a coffee maker already constructing a Death Star to give her dominion over the universe? Actually, the truth was more mundane. Piers, who's an expert in faking a good scoop, had simply plagiarised Lord George Robertson's big book of burbling idiocy, specifically the chapter where an independent Scotland ditches Trident, NATO instantly falls apart, and the forces of darkness obliterate civilization, leaving only cockroaches, including, very possibly, Piers Morgan. As for actual lies, today's choice is a no-brainer, which is appropriate because it comes from Jim Murphy. Breaking the embarrassed silence after his comeuppance from cold-eyed head office hitman Chuka Umunna, he came out the other night with his now infamous tweet that the SNP manifesto had broken a promise over a second referendum. Well, no, Jim. Once in a generation wasn't a promise. It was a personal opinion from Alex Salmond, who carefully described it in those terms, as you'd have heard if you hadn't been yelling SNP bad at the hat stand. And even if it was a promise, it hasn't been broken because the SNP haven't actually called a referendum. They didn't rule it out, but neither did they rule out free unicorn-flavoured ice cream for every teenager or Scotland annexing China. Anyhow, what's it got to do with politicians? We, the people, will decide. Terrifying, isn't it?